Something very telling is happening inside the Pittsburgh Steelers organization right now. And if you really take a step back and look at how this team is planning ahead, it becomes clear that this isn't just about the 2026 season. It's about setting up the foundation for 2027 and beyond. The key to understanding this strategy is not just looking at the current roster, but focusing on something most fans overlook: the upcoming 2027 free agent class, and how it quietly shapes the Steelers' draft decisions today. Right now, the Steelers are heading into the 2026 NFL Draft with 12 total picks, the most in the entire league, and while a lot of fans naturally expect immediate starters from a class that large, that's not how NFL teams typically operate. The reality is, especially as the draft progresses into day 2 and day 3, teams are not just drafting for today, they're drafting for tomorrow. They're identifying positions that could become problems a year from now and trying to get ahead of them before they turn into real weaknesses. And when you look at Pittsburgh's situation, one of the first areas that stands out is the left guard position. Both Brock Hoffman and Spencer Anderson are entering the final year of their contracts, which means there's a very real chance neither is part of the long-term future beyond 2026. That puts pressure on the front office, led by Omar Khan, to find a player who can either compete immediately or develop into a starter by the start of the 2027 season. This isn't just about depth. This is about identifying a future cornerstone on the offensive line. But it doesn't stop there. The interior offensive line depth as a whole is quietly becoming a concern. Ryan McCollum, currently a backup center, is also on a one-year deal and expected to hit free agency in 2027. So when you really break it down, multiple depth pieces across the interior line could be gone at the same time. That's not something you want to deal with all at once, and it strongly suggests the Steelers will use at least one late-round pick to develop a backup guard or center, someone who can grow into a reliable role over time. Then you shift to the tackle position and things get even more interesting. Both Dylan Cook and Broderick Jones are projected to be free agents in 2027. Cook showed promise, especially with solid play at left tackle, but his track record is still limited. As for Jones, injuries and inconsistency have raised questions about whether the Steelers will commit to him long term. That uncertainty opens the door for Pittsburgh to potentially invest in another offensive tackle, maybe even as early as the first round, especially considering Omar Khan's clear preference for building through the trenches. And here's where it gets strategic. Even if the Steelers don't feel immediate pressure to replace those players, they could still draft a tackle now, develop him behind the current group, and be ready with a seamless transition in 2027. That's how smart franchises stay competitive without needing to rebuild. Now let's flip to the defensive side, because there's another layer forming there. The safety position is quietly becoming a long-term concern. Jaquan Brisker is currently on a one-year deal, and while he brings starting ability, there are durability concerns, including concussion history. Behind him, depth players like Darnell Savage and Sebastian Castro are also heading toward free agency. Add in the fact that Deshaun Elliott is getting closer to his 30s, and suddenly you're looking at a position group that could need a complete reset within a year. That's why it wouldn't be surprising at all to see the Steelers target a safety by the end of day 2 in the draft. Not necessarily someone who starts immediately, but someone who can develop into a long-term piece in the secondary. And then there's linebacker, another position with uncertainty. Patrick Queen's future isn't fully locked in yet. If he thrives in the new defensive system, there's a strong case for bringing him back. But if his performance doesn't meet expectations, he could easily be gone in 2027. Malik Harrison is also likely to hit the market, leaving potential gaps in both depth and physical presence. That points toward the Steelers adding a developmental linebacker on day 3, someone with upside who can be molded over time. Even the cornerback room, which looks solid on the surface, has underlying questions. While Joey Porter Jr. is expected to be a long-term piece, much of the depth behind him, including Asante Samuel Jr., Brandon Eccles, Corey Trice Jr., and others, could all be gone by 2027. That makes corner another sneaky position where Pittsburgh might invest a late-round pick just to maintain stability and depth. When you connect all these dots, a clear pattern emerges. The Steelers are not just drafting for immediate needs. They are carefully mapping out where this roster could face turnover and making calculated moves to stay ahead of it. It's a quiet strategy, but it's a smart one, and it reflects a front office that is thinking 2 steps ahead rather than reacting in the moment. So now the big question becomes this. Looking at all these potential future gaps across the roster, which position do you think the Steelers absolutely cannot afford to get wrong in this draft if they want to stay competitive beyond 2026? And that's exactly where this entire conversation starts to get even more interesting, because once you identify those future pressure points across the roster, you begin to understand that this draft is less about finding stars right away and more about avoiding future crises before they even happen. Take a step back and think about it from the Steelers' perspective. You have 12 draft picks, which gives you flexibility, but it also gives you responsibility. You can't just swing on one or two big names and ignore the rest. This is a draft where Pittsburgh has the opportunity to quietly reload multiple position groups at once, especially when you consider how many players could be walking out the door in 2027. And what stands out the most is how interconnected all of this really is. For example, if the Steelers decide to invest heavily in the offensive line early, like say a guard in round 1 or 2, and then another interior depth piece later, that immediately stabilizes one of the most uncertain areas of the roster heading into the future. It gives you flexibility with contracts, it gives you leverage in negotiations, and most importantly, it protects whoever ends up being the long-term answer at quarterback. Because let's be honest, everything still comes back to that position. Even though this specific breakdown is focused on the 2027 free agent class, the reality is that every single move the Steelers make, especially in the trenches, is tied to building a stable environment for the quarterback position. You can't develop consistency there if your offensive line is constantly being rebuilt year after year. Now flip that same logic over to the defensive side. If you wait too long to address safety, you risk entering 2027 with aging players, expiring contracts, and no clear successor ready to step in. That's how teams end up overpaying in free agency or reaching in the draft out of desperation. Pittsburgh is clearly trying to avoid that scenario by identifying someone now, developing them properly, and letting them grow into the role naturally. The same goes for linebacker. If Patrick Queen doesn't take that next step and Malik Harrison moves on as expected, suddenly what looks like a solid room today could turn into a question mark very quickly. That's why bringing in a developmental piece now, even if he barely sees the field in year 1, could end up being one of the most important moves of this entire class 2 years from now. And don't overlook the psychological side of this strategy either. When you draft players knowing they don't have to start right away, you create a completely different development environment. There's less pressure, more time to learn the system, more time to adjust to the speed of the NFL. And historically, that's when the Steelers have been at their best, developing talent patiently rather than forcing it too early. Another layer to this is how Omar Khan has approached roster building since taking over. There's a very clear emphasis on controlling the line of scrimmage and maintaining flexibility, drafting trench players early, adding depth late, and always thinking one contract cycle ahead. That's not random, that's a philosophy. And this draft feels like a continuation of that approach. Even the idea of possibly drafting another offensive tackle, despite already having options on the roster, speaks to that mindset. It's not about panic, it's about preparation. If Dylan Cook regresses or Broderick Jones doesn't fully develop into the player they hoped for, you're not scrambling. You already have a plan in place. And when you look across the entire roster, that's really the theme here: insurance. Not in a reactive sense, but in a proactive, calculated way. Every pick has the potential to serve a purpose, not just this season, but 1 or 2 years down the line. So when draft night arrives, don't be surprised if some of the picks don't immediately excite everyone. Don't be surprised if the Steelers pass on a flashy name in favor of a lineman or a developmental defender, because internally, those might be the moves that matter the most. This is how stable organizations stay competitive year after year without falling into cycles of rebuilding. They anticipate problems before they happen, and they trust their development process enough to think long term. And if you really think about it, this balance between building for the future and still trying to compete right now is what defines where the Steelers truly are as a franchise at this moment. They're not a rebuilding team, but they're also not in a position where they can ignore long-term roster health just to chase short-term results. That middle ground is tricky, and it's exactly why this draft feels so important. Because if they get this right, what you're looking at is a roster that doesn't just stay competitive in 2026, but actually becomes more stable and more complete heading into 2027. You're talking about a team that could potentially avoid major holes across the offensive line, maintain depth in the secondary, and have young, developing talent ready to step into bigger roles without missing a beat. But if they get it wrong, if they misjudge which positions matter matter most or wait too long to address key areas, then all of a sudden you're heading into 2027 with multiple needs at once. And that's when things spiral. That's when you're forced into bad contracts, risky draft reaches, or patchwork solutions that don't hold up over a full season. That's why what we're seeing right now isn't just draft prep, it's roster forecasting. It's understanding not just who your players are today, but who they'll be or won't be a year from now. And that level of planning is what separates consistent playoff teams from those stuck trying to figure things out every offseason. So as all of this unfolds, keep an eye not just on who the Steelers pick, but why they pick them. Look at the positions, look at the timing, and ask yourself how that player fits into the bigger picture a year or two down the road. Because chances are that's exactly how the front office is thinking about it. Now I want to hear from you one more time. If you had to choose just one position that the Steelers must secure for the future in this draft no matter what would it be and why? And this is where the conversation really stays alive even after the draft is over, because the real evaluation of this class won't happen in year 1. It's going to happen in year 2 and year 3 when these decisions either start paying off or start exposing gaps that weren't properly addressed. Think about how many times we've seen players drafted on day 2 or day 3 who barely saw the field as rookies, only to become key contributors later on. That's the exact type of outcome the Steelers are betting on with this approach. They're trusting their scouting, their coaching staff, and their development pipeline to turn raw or rotational players into dependable starters when the time comes. And that patience is critical, especially when you're dealing with positions like offensive line, safety, and linebacker. These aren't always plug-and-play roles. These are positions where understanding the system, building chemistry, and adjusting to NFL speed can take time. So drafting ahead of need gives you that cushion. It gives you the ability to let players grow without forcing them into situations they're not ready for. At the same time, there's always that internal pressure to get immediate value, especially with a fan base that wants to see progress right away. That's the challenge for Pittsburgh, balancing what fans expect now with what the roster will need later. And based on everything we're seeing, it feels like the organization is leaning toward discipline over urgency. They're not ignoring the present, but they're clearly refusing to